Okay, welcome everyone to First Place for Health's webinar, monthly webinar with my dear friend, Deb Gruelle. Deb is going to share with us tonight some of her personal story of how she has overcome obstacles in her life, how actually God has been able to bring her dreams to come true in spite of things that have happened in her life that she has been able to overcome through the power of the Holy Spirit and through Christ himself. But before Deb gets started, I just want to tell you a little bit about her. She is a personal friend of mine. She is a friend to First Place for Health because she is in my virtual group that meets on Wednesdays with other writers and speakers. And I have in my hands her newest book, 10 Little Fireflies. Not only does she write children's books, but she also writes nonfiction. But this one and her other one, 10 Little Stars, I can't find that one because my granddaughters took it home. So Deb is a personal friend of mine and personal inspiration to me. And she's a friend of First Place for Health. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to my friend, Deb Gruelle. Deb, just come on and say hey to everybody.
Hi, Vicki. Am I showing up?
You're showing up and we can hear you loud and clear.
Awesome. So good to be here.
Thank you for giving us this time tonight. And I'm not going to spend any more time on introducing Deb. I'm going to let her now share her story. She will be glad to take questions near the end of her presentation tonight. So if you look on your screen, you see your chat, but you also see a Q&A window that you can put your questions in. And if time allows, Deb will be glad to answer those questions. Anything else, Deb, you want to say before we get started?
No, that's it.
Oh, thank you for being here. So I am going to disappear and let Deb take over.
All right. Thanks so much, Vicki, and all y'all who are here tonight. Did I say that right? I'm in California, but I just love my friends there in the South. And don't you just love First Place for Health? I've come to love Vicki and all those involved here and just love their goal for a balanced life in body, soul, mind, and spirit. Just a great organization, and I admire all of you for being on that journey. So I know how encouraging and fun it is to hear stories of miracles and healing, and I've got some of those tonight, but I also want to encourage those of us who have prayers that just aren't answered with a miracle and who live with limitations that remain year after year. Because although the first half of Hebrews 11 mentions the miracles that happen because of people's faith, the second half of Hebrews also has people of faith who did not get their prayers of deliverance answered. And God still loves and cares about those people just as much. So for me, I've lived most of my adult life with some major life limitations. Maybe you have too. I'll tell you about some of mine and how I have railed against these limits, prayed with faith for God to overcome them, felt guilty that I didn't have enough faith to enable the miracles I longed for, and what I finally figured out. So often we're taught that having faith means pushing against all our limitations and trusting God to overcome them. But after living with many of these limitations for decades, I'm beginning to see another side. So that's part of what I want to share with you tonight. So let me share my screen so you can see my slides that I've prepared. So I want to ask you to participate and answer this question. Think of a limitation you live with that just hasn't gone away. Though you've prayed for it to be removed, it's still something you struggle with. Would you type it in the chat so we can see it? Maybe you have a physical or a health limitation that's changed your life. Or you may live with anxiety, or you've experienced trauma and live with emotional scars. Or maybe you have a child with a disability or need to caretake for elderly parents. And though you value them deeply, you long for time to pursue your dreams. Maybe you experience ongoing limits in your energy or your finances or your relationships. You may feel like these things that take much of your time or energy in some ways can keep you from becoming all you're meant to be. So let me see if I can look at the chat to see some of your answers. Okay, chronic pain, finances, emotional eating, toxic relationships, fibromyalgia and fatigue, anxiety, rheumatoid arthritis, self-sabotage, cancer, knee pain, dyslexia, finances. I saw a daughter with a troubling relationship, eyesight, macular degeneration, COVID. So many of those are long-term, and somebody said long COVID. That I can relate to definitely. So I wanted to ask the next question, how did you feel when you were entering in that limitation? Did any of you feel that you were comparing yourself to others, or frustration at having to live with that, or self-doubt? And you don't have to type these in. You can just think about them if you want. If you want to share, you're welcome to, but think about how you felt as you were typing in those limitations. Shame can be another issue that we struggle with when we think other people are just surging forward without any problems and we are struggling. We can feel frustrated or defeated. And I want to say, God gives us agency, which is the responsibility to make decisions for ourselves. That's the, he gave that to us as we were created. And we're supposed to make good choices for our lives. And that can absolutely help us grow and overcome some of our limitations. But what about the issues where we do all that's in our power, but our limitations don't budge and they remain with us for the long haul? What does that mean? Does it mean we're lacking faith or have hidden sin in our lives? I have dealt with that question. I wondered if I lacked willpower or conviction. And would the limitations that remained in my life eventually disqualify me from living my best life? God's been teaching me these last few years that it's possible to flip the way I view limitations. So let me share a couple of the major limitations I've lived with and 3 different ways I see that God chooses to answer prayers. So everyone has stories of hardships and limitations. It seems that God's been trying to teach me about limitations almost all my adult life. I'm just a really slow learner. My childhood until my 20s was great. My mom and dad were loving, authentic Christians, and I learned to love Jesus from a very young age. I was always in a Bible study, became a leader in our youth group, and followed my new husband to seminary. I grew into a rather simplistic view of God's truth, though. I thought if I trust and follow God, he will bless me. Then, right when I was thinking the world was opening up to me, major setbacks began to happen that opened the door to so many limitations and insecurities and even fear in my life. I began to question my purpose, whether I even had a purpose, or whether I'd been disqualified from serving God totally. One of my first dreams as an adult, really from childhood, was to be a mom. I felt it was a calling for me. And this is how I felt. I was mad when instead of sailing into parenthood like all of my friends were doing, Instead of getting knocked up by my husband, I got knocked sideways by infertility and then by several miscarriages. I just wanted to be a mom. It took 17 long years of both primary and secondary infertility and losing babies. I lost 7 babies to miscarriage. We even heard their heartbeats, and then they were gone. We tried to adopt, and 5 potential adoptions fell through. Once we waited for 7 months for the mom to give birth, and then she changed her mind. I wanted to flourish. I wanted to become all that I felt God was calling me to be. And instead, I kept being sucked back into monthly cycles of grief and frustration, and grief over each baby I lost. I ended up spending so many hours in doctor appointments and medical procedures that it could have counted as a part-time job. And with all the time I spent in stirrups, I feel I at least should be an accomplished horsewoman by now. But I didn't realize when we scheduled this months ago that it would be the day after Mother's Day. And I know that day can be very hard for many. Some have lost their moms or grieved for the good relationship they never got to have with their mom. So just know you're not alone. I felt held back through all of those 17 years until God finally provided the miracles of our hoped for 3 children. We had 2 bio boys as our oldest and youngest, and our daughter was in the middle, who came into our family through adoption from China. The first way that God sometimes chooses to answer our limitations is He helps us overcome our circumstances so we win. He changes the world around us so we are able to succeed. And His glory shines. All those years of not being able to have children, every child's a miracle, but those miracles were glowing with God's glory. We noticed Him working, and we all cheered along. He eventually answered my 17 years of prayer, and I was so very grateful for those miracles. And God also can use our limits to guide us into our best life that He had planned for us long before the world began. So His glory still shines. This is what I believe God did to guide us into adopting our daughter. Part of His answer was to redirect our dreams to adoption. And I've learned to trust that God's plans were better than mine. But soon after our last child arrived, a strange illness returned. I'd first been hit with it when I was 20, but I had eventually gotten better. The worst exacerbation of this illness, which is called ME, which stands for myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is a mouthful, it came back into my life in my early 40s, right after I'd gotten the blessing of all these children. I became so weak I could hardly walk or even stand. At first I needed a cane, and then I went to a wheelchair, and then an electric scooter. I had seizures, so I wasn't allowed to drive anymore, and debilitating fatigue and weakness. I was virtually housebound. Even with someone driving me and using a head and back support because I couldn't sit up, I couldn't sit through an hour church service. So when I was able to go, I had to lay down on the last pew in the back of the church through the service. I was really a sick puppy. I lost my ability to communicate. I had trouble understanding conversations, and I stuttered. I slurred my words and had aphasia. You know, aphasia, that's the fun impairment where the words you want to say come out as totally different words altogether. It's not fun, and it's quite embarrassing. And I lost my mind. Really, of all the things I lost during that time, I missed my brain the most. Now I had brain damage with neurological issues that caused me to fall into walls, as well as prevented planning and processing and caused memory issues. talk about frustration at life limits. Little did I know that this time the exacerbation would last 9.5 years. And here I was trying to mother these children that God had finally blessed me with. My body became a prison that I didn't recognize. I've always been a type A personality, but now I was living in a type B body. I saw doctors, was anointed with oil and prayed over by our pastors. I spent thousands of dollars on supplements and diets and medicine. During that time, out of pure desperation, I also learned to pray and connect to God in a much deeper way. One of the reasons was because praying was one of the only things I could still do while laying down. It broke my spirit and battered me through those drawn out trials. Yet I clung to God through each storm. Frankly, I didn't believe life was worth living without God in it. But I didn't understand why God didn't answer my grief-stricken prayers to heal my body. I wondered if he'd put me on a shelf and forgotten me. I'd written a book for Christian women going through infertility and miscarriages, but during these years, writing anything was way beyond my ability. Word finding was an issue for me, and I was so sick that at times I struggled to put 5 words together in a sentence, in a conversation. Writing was just out of the question. So this has been a really interesting answer that I found that how God answers. God hasn't answered any of my prayers for my health in the ways that I asked him to. Instead, he's allowed those illnesses and the limitations to remain. And so this is the third way. Sometimes God lets our limits remain, but gives us the power to fulfill our purpose and live our fullest life within those limits. We still win, though it may look different, but his glory still shines. So when I started looking, I found lots of biblical examples of God answering this way. And I'm going to share with you 2 of my favorite Bible buds and what I realized as I reread these stories in the light of limitations. The first is Gideon. You know why? Because Gideon was small. One version even called him scrawny, and he was weak and afraid. Yay, a person like me in the Bible. You know the story in Judges 6, Gideon was living at a time when the Midianites had been terrorizing the Israelites for years. Gideon was oppressed, poor, scrawny, confused, and so fearful, he was hiding inside a wine press to do his work, a threshing wheat. And in verses 12 to 13, it says, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Gideon replied, pardon me? Gideon, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders? Don't you love his honesty? Despite this, God invited Gideon to be the one to lead, even when he was afraid and scrawny and weak and had no status. God didn't remove his fear first or give him steroids to bulk up before he asked him to leave, and nothing was changed to give Gideon more status among his peers first. God invited Gideon into his plan just as he was, afraid, scrawny, weak, and with no Instagram followers. Can you believe it? So I just love Gideon because he's an example of who God chooses. And I also love Moses. Why? Because Moses had a speech impediment, but God asked him to speak for him. He didn't heal Moses' speech impediment before asking him into this amazing plan to free his people from Egypt in Exodus 6. In verse 12, in some different versions, say that he had a stutter, or he was deficient in speaking, or a poor speaker, or unskilled, or clumsy, or Moses' words saying, I'm not fit to speak for you. And I just really relate to that. God wasn't frustrated by Moses and Gideon's ongoing limitations. God invites people with limitations into his plan all the time. In the last few years, God's been showing me, like he did for both of these men, how my weakness displays his power. Their limitations let God's fame be seen more clearly and even change their lives for the better in ways that qualified them to step into their calling. So here I was at my weakest, and to show me how my weakness displayed his power while I was still severely limited, God sent me an invitation. On a hot day in July in 2015, I was once again going through the repetitive motions of doing laundry. And I started noticing this restlessness in my spirit. And so I started to pray about it. No kids were at home, so I started to pray out loud. God, I'm so grateful for all you've done to help me survive these hard years. I'm feeling kind of stirred up inside today and wanting something more. My world feels really small right now. And maybe things have settled down enough that I finally have enough buffer in my life to hope for something more than just surviving. So I'm just going to ask you, if it won't spoil some vast eternal plan, kind of like Tevye on Fiddler on the Roof, I think that's how I was praying, would you do something to enlarge my influence and my world? Then I leave my request with God and go back to folding towels. And I just wanted to let you know that just like Gideon, I also had no Instagram followers at that time. The next afternoon, our home phone rings. Yeah, we still had a home phone with a number that we'd had for decades, and God can even use that. So I picked up the receiver and I hear someone speaking English as a second language and asking for me. And I'd gotten on some scamming call lists from people pretending to be the IRS. So my scam radar is on high alert. I'm rolling my eyes, about to hang up when the woman says a name I recognize, Afton. It takes me a minute to place that unusual name. And then I recognize it as the editor I'd worked with when my first book was published over 20 years ago. And now she has my attention. So I start listening more closely. She says, I got your name and number from Afton. My name is Anna, and I live in Hungary. I'm calling because we want to translate and publish a second edition of your book on infertility and miscarriage. I am super confused. I'm thinking this must be one of those twists on a Nigerian scam. Something is off. And then she says she works for a Christian publisher. This makes no sense. I don't even know if that publisher is legit. So I think I'll be smart and figure it out. So I ask her for the publisher's name, and she tells me, which of course doesn't help one bit because I don't know any names of any Hungarian publishers. I barely know where Hungary is on a map. Next, I try, but it's been over 20 years since my book was published. It's even out of print now. I'm sure it would make more sense to translate a more recently published infertility book. Have I said yet that I'm not a strong marketing person either? She says, we've looked at other infertility books that have been published since yours, but we can't find any that cover the subject as thoroughly as your book. So we'd like to ask for permission and the rights to translate and republish your book. What? I try to throw up one last roadblock, but the book has medical chapters in it, and I would need a doctor to help update those chapters, and I don't have a doctor to help me update those parts. And Anna patiently replies, yes, that's true, but we already have a Christian infertility specialist who's agreed to help update the medical portions and to make sure they match our Hungarian medical practices too. We also have a Christian psychologist standing by and an adoption expert ready to help. It seems she has an answer for all my roadblocks, so I give up on my logical objections. I ask her to tell me the story of why she's calling. And as her words begin to sink in, I lower myself onto a kitchen chair because my legs suddenly won't hold me up anymore. And then Holy Spirit goosebumps start to make the hairs on my arms stand up. I begin to understand that something supernatural is happening right here and right now. She says, 20 years ago, a pastor from Hungary went to a conference in America. He brought back your book to us here. We had no book on infertility in Hungary, not Christian or for the general market. So we passed around your book and we began to write Hungarian translations between the lines and in the margins. Your book became a lifeline to many of the women here in Hungary who were going through infertility or miscarriage. Chokes me up. After that, I've got nothing. Stunned, I thank her and end the call by asking for her contact information. I tell her I'll get back to her within a couple of days. I still want to check this publisher's legit, and it turns out they've done a great job publishing Gary Smalley's books and several other big Christian authors. But when I hang up, I just sit in this chair staring at the wall. My mind whirls from the bizarre conversation from the other side of the world. It was from a country I had no known connection with. How could that have happened when my world was so small? And then it clicks. I told you I'm slow. My prayer the day before, my Father God, that was you. That could not have been done by anyone else but you. It was my limited perspective that left me feeling so disconnected. But God in his graciousness to me pulled back a curtain that had blocked me from seeing that I had influenced others positively. He gave me this miraculous glimpse of what he was doing behind the scenes. And we don't often get to see things from God's viewpoint, but that day he gave me a glimpse. So when God was that clear, although I felt there was no way I could do it, I still stepped out with fear and trembling, but I said yes to God's next step. I stepped back into writing by working with the editor at Harmat, the publisher in Hungary, over the next 10 months, and the next May, the Hungarian version of my infertility book, Aching for a Child, was released just in time for a large Christian conference being held there. I call that God showing off. His glory was definitely seen because my limitations were so glaring. I knew no one, but my small prayer connected me to a mighty God who knew everyone in the world. And I just got out the second edition in English too. Took me years, but I was able to do that. So I believe God made these events happen in just this way so that his glory could be clearly seen. With all the struggles and limitations I have, there's no way I could have made any of that happen. God turned the pain in my infertility into a message of hope for others who were hurting, helped me write a book about it, and then 20 years later used it to remind me again of his purpose, counting so much more than my weakness. And since that time, because God wasn't done showing off yet, he's opened doors in miraculous ways for other books. And God has multiplied my meager attempts above and beyond even a glimmer of what I could ever hope or imagine. And what's even crazier, few years later, God nudged me to start speaking publicly. And though God had healed parts of my body and brain by this point, he wasn't offering to heal me totally first. I was terrified, freaked out like Gideon. I asked, have you heard me talk? You know I can't stand for more than 3 minutes, and my brain can't even remember the word Christmas in a conversation. But I heard God whisper, as he said to Gideon, go with the strength you have and with all the limitations you have. They won't limit God one bit. I was learning to trust the God who was asking, so feeling like a fraud and a crazy person, I obeyed and looked for ways to prepare. I signed up for Toastmasters. The first time I spoke, I had to sit on a stool and I read my talk. I read it to a group of 200 women. I know 10 would have been a better number to start with, but that's what God provided. And that I got through that first talk was the first miracle. That they asked me back was the second. And the next couple of years, God opened the doors for me to speak dozens of times. Only God. I see this in coaching writers, and I find that they often want to get to their writing goal and finish by tomorrow. But the more important thing than reaching their writing goal fast is that they set intentional, small, attainable goals that build up small wins to encourage them to keep going in the right direction. God cares about the process we go through as much as the end product. And if you're one of the few who are in a season of soaring without limitations right now, praise God and soar on. If you come across someone who has been living with limitations, though, instead of thinking that you need to fix them, I invite you to try instead to sit quietly with them and listen closely to what they've been learning. You may be talking to a Gideon or a Moses and could even learn from them how to see God in a new and clearer way. Our job is to stay close to God and learn to discern his voice. And if you need a fleece like Gideon, ask God to clarify what he's calling you to do. Then if God calls you to step into a new purpose, you don't need to wait for complete healing or all your limitations to be lifted first. Go with the strength you have and with all the limitations you have. Your weakness or limitations won't limit God. So what can you do when you're the one who finds yourself limited and you feel like your dreams are out of reach? Here are 3 things. The first is build your core relationship with God, which is your identity in Christ. During your season of limitation, concentrate on developing your core connection with God that no one and nothing else can touch. It's a continuing process to learn to hear and believe God's voice above anyone else's, especially the critical ones, including your own. And you'll need this strong core relationship with God for anything that comes in the future. Number 2 is to set smaller goals during this hard season. Give yourself grace, but don't let go of the dream God has planted in your heart. I still need to walk with a cane, and my Stanford doctor helps me limit my physical activity. I also live within my limits by planning fewer events and plan lots of extra time to prepare and rest before and after any event. But I'm so glad I obeyed God's nudge to step out in the meager strength I had and have been able to see God filling in my huge limitations with himself. I honestly believe I'm living my best life right now. And 3, know God sees you, cares deeply for your suffering, and no limitations can limit God or his good plan for your life. God will use your current limitations to prepare you for your good purpose that he has had planned all along, and his glory will shine even brighter. I hope you'll reread the stories of Gideon and Moses again and trust that if God is nudging you to do something, his abilities will more than cover whatever limits are a part of your life right now. And if you do these things in your season of limitation, when God asks you to step out, even if his request is audacious like Gideon, you'll be ready to go with the strength you have. And your strength will be more than enough when God fills in with his abilities, because the seeds of God's story, of God's glory, are in your story, and they include your limitations. Thanks so much for letting me talk with you tonight. I'd love to hear from you. Here's how you can get in touch. And Vicki, do you have any closing comments?
I do, and I'm going to switch our view back to something standard. Okay. I'm back. Yes, Deb, I have like 100 things that I've written in my journal right here, but I'm not going to go over all those 100 things. Before we finish up, this webinar has been recorded. It will be on First Place for Healthy YouTube channel. I'm going to watch it again and again because I raise my hand really high, Deb, when we think about limitations. Don't take that away yet. If you're watching this later after tonight or you're watching it tonight, debgruelle.com. You will find her books there. Order them. Order her children's books. You didn't say anything about your children's books, and they're so.
I didn't.
They're so
That was just
beautiful.
the additional books that is just God's gravy on top of everything else. Okay, you'd asked me to show these. So
Yes,
this is
show them.
my infertility book, Aching for a Child. And that's the one that's in Hungarian also. And this is my first book, 10 Little Night Stars. And somehow God put his finger of favor on this book and made it a bestseller and award winner. And even though I had kept it in a drawer for 16 years after I wrote it and didn't think it was good enough. The second children's book was Sleepy Time Colors, and that's about, this one's about counting and has a bedtime routine for kids. And my heart is just to help them feel comforted and secure as they fall asleep. And this one teaches colors. And this is the one that just came out a couple months ago, 10 Little Fireflies. And this one counts down to bedtime and has these little woodland animals counting the fireflies as they're in the backyard. And we don't have fireflies in California, so I learned to love them. I was born in Ohio, and my relatives are back there, so we would go back for family vacations, and they were just magical. So I loved how God put them there for our enjoyment.
And in the South, we call them lightning bugs.
Lightning bugs.
Lightning bugs, because
I love that.
We call them lightning bugs, but they're fireflies. Actually, you're exactly right. But whatever you call them, they are magical. And this book is so sweet. Deb's books are beautiful gifts, and I'm thinking how timely, Deb, this webinar is the Monday after Mother's Day. Because
we didn't plan that.
We did. It's like I always say, I didn't plan this. And my husband always says, my pastor, well, God planned it. Somebody planned it. We have a couple of questions. The biggest question is, would you restate this part of your presentation? My answer to that would be just watch this again, and you'll be able to capture everything that Deb has shared with us tonight. But a couple of things that I wrote down a ton of things, but what I think made such an impression, that you were so surprised that God answered your prayer. And it's interesting that he answers prayers in different ways, because your prayers for infertility, he chose to answer in a different way, because God turned your infertility into a message of hope for thousands of people. And sometimes, don't we want him to answer prayers our way?
Absolutely, because we see that's the best way. Yeah. And it takes growth to learn that my way is not always the best way. And I can trust God much more than I can trust myself.
Yeah, I love that. I did write that down. And then go with the strength you have. I think you can stop sharing now, Deb, because I hope everybody has debgruelle.com, and and you can always reach out to Deb. She is so happy to receive your emails if you need any further encouragement, because as I'm listening, even though I knew your story, it's once again inspired me. And I know that many of that are First Place family, and those that are joining, whether they know about First Place or not, visit our website, firstplaceforhelp.com, and you will see many hope stories of God going beyond personal limitations, as he did in your life, Deb. So thank you for being with us. And I hope that we will get to have webinar 2 on the next thing that God is doing in your life. You have been such a blessing to us.
Well, thanks for this, heading up this wonderful organization that it just is inspiring to be with you in Bible study and to watch how you are caring for all the people in God's kingdom, and the praising the small steps toward health and good and all that we can be in God.
Yeah, because sometimes it is about the next small step that we can take, because as we saw, many of you in the chat, you have lots of limitations like Deb and that I have with my rheumatoid arthritis, but a step is still a step.
Yes.
It's still a step.
Yes.
And we're moving, because he said, in me, I want you to live and move and have your being. And then we go in the strength we have.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
God's strength is enough to
It is
fill in
not
all
limited.
huge
Yes,
gaps.
I love that. Okay, well, thank you, Deb, so much. And all of you that were with us tonight, God bless you all. And we'll see you next month for our next webinar, First Place for Help.
It's been a pleasure.
Yep, changing lives 1 pound at a time. Good night.
Good night.